In 1935, Europe was not at war, but peace, in any meaningful sense, was already gone. The scars of the First World War still defined politics, diplomacy, and public opinion. In Britain and France, the memory of trench warfare and mass death had created one overriding priority. Another war must be avoided at almost any cost. This fear shaped every major decision, and it was precisely this fear that would be exploited. In Germany, power was now fully concentrated in the hands of Adolf Hitler. With the death of President Hindenburg the previous year, Hitler had combined the roles of chancellor and head of state, ruling without meaningful opposition. The Nazi regime no longer pretended to accept the post-war settlement imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. It regarded the treaty not as law, but as an injustice to be undone. Yet Germany did not begin with tanks or troops crossing borders. Instead, it began with something far more subtle. Legitimacy died in January 1935. The Saar region rich in coal and placed under international supervision. After World War I held a plebiscite to determine its future. Administered by the League of Nations, the vote was meant to symbolize collective security and international cooperation. Instead, it became a triumph for Nazi Germany. Over 90% of voters chose to rejoin Germany. For Hitler, the message was clear. Germany could revise the post-war order openly, legally, and peacefully, and the world would accept it. No sanctions followed. No emergency summits. No military response. Across Europe, leaders reassured themselves that this was a special case, a justified correction of past wrongs. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The authority of international agreements was weakening. The credibility of enforcement was fading. 1935 was the year when the rules still existed, but no one was willing to defend them. And Hitler was watching very carefully. If the Saar vote showed that the post-war order could be challenged, 1935 proved it could be openly destroyed. In March, Adolf Hitler took a step that removed all remaining ambiguity about Germany's intentions. In a public announcement, he confirmed what foreign intelligence services had long suspected: Germany was rebuilding its air force. The Luftwaffe, forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles, now officially existed. It was no longer a secret program, it was a declaration. Only 2 weeks later came an even more dramatic move. Hitler announced the reintroduction of compulsory military service. Germany would no longer be limited to a small professional army. Instead, it would raise a force of 36 divisions, around 500,000 men. This was not a technical violation or a legal loophole. It was a direct, deliberate rejection of the treaty that had defined Europe since 1919. Once again, the reaction was cautious and restrained. Britain and France issued formal protests, but neither was prepared to act. Their armed forces were underfunded and unprepared, and public opinion remained overwhelmingly hostile to the idea of another war. Many politicians argued that Germany was only reclaiming its right to self-defense. Behind the scenes, British leaders hoped diplomacy could still work. If Germany were allowed limited rearmament, perhaps Hitler could be persuaded to cooperate, to rejoin international institutions, and to accept boundaries elsewhere. Concessions, they believed, might buy stability. But rearmament did not stop with soldiers and aircraft. In June, Germany launched a new U-boat, violating naval restrictions imposed after World War I. Submarines had once brought Britain to the brink of starvation. Their return caused quiet alarm within the Royal Navy. Each step followed the same pattern. Germany advanced, the treaties were broken, and Europe protested but did nothing. Every success reinforced Hitler's belief that his opponents lacked both unity and resolve. The balance of power was shifting, not through sudden conquest, but through calculated defiance. And with every unanswered violation, the cost of stopping Germany grew higher. By the spring of 1935, the pace of German rearmament was alarming even to those who had once argued for patience. If treaties alone could no longer restrain Berlin, perhaps unity might. In April, the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy met in the Italian resort town of Stresa, determined at least in public to present a common front against further German violations of the post-war order. The so-called Stresa Front was meant to send a clear warning to Berlin. The three powers agreed to oppose any additional breaches of the Treaty of Versailles and to defend the independence of Austria, which Adolf Hitler had already made clear was a future target. For a brief moment, it appeared that Europe might finally act in concert, but the unity was fragile from the start. Each country arrived with different priorities and fears. France wanted firm guarantees and clear military commitments. Italy sought recognition as a great power and freedom of action elsewhere. Britain, above all, wanted to avoid war and believed that Germany's grievances could still be managed. Through negotiation. Only 2 months later, the Stresa Front collapsed. Without consulting its partners, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. The treaty allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of the size of the Royal Navy, an explicit violation of Versailles, now sanctioned by London itself. To British planners, the deal seemed pragmatic. They feared a nightmare scenario, a naval war against Germany in European waters, while simultaneously facing Japan in the Pacific. Limiting German naval growth through agreement appeared safer than confrontation. To France, the agreement was a shock. Prime Minister Pierre Laval saw it as a betrayal that destroyed the credibility of collective resistance. To Italy, it was proof that strength, not treaties, commanded respect. Benito Mussolini drew his own conclusion. If Britain and France would not stand firm in Europe, they would not stand firm elsewhere. The failure of the Stresa Front did more than weaken diplomacy. It taught the dictators of Europe a crucial lesson: unity among the democracies was temporary, conditional, and easily broken, and one of them was already preparing to test that lesson in Africa. In the autumn of 1935, Europe's diplomatic failures produced their first major consequence. Convinced that Britain and France lacked the will to act decisively, Benito Mussolini launched a long-planned invasion of Ethiopia. It was one of the few remaining independent states in Africa, and its conquest was meant to crown Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire. Italian forces crossed the border from Eritrea and Somaliland with overwhelming superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Against them stood an Ethiopian army that relied largely on outdated weapons and sheer determination. The war was brutal and one-sided. Italian aircraft bombed villages and supply routes, while poison gas outlawed by international conventions was used repeatedly to break resistance. The invasion placed the international system on trial. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations, invoking the principles of collective security on which the League was founded. In response, the League formally declared Italy the aggressor and imposed economic sanctions. For the first time in history, the international community attempted to punish a major power for waging an illegal war. But the sanctions were fatally flawed. They did not include oil, the one resource Italy could not do without. Major non-member states, including the United States, Germany, and Japan, were not bound by them. Even some League members quietly ignored the restrictions. As a result, the economic impact on Italy was minimal. Mussolini had gambled that the League would protest loudly and act weakly. He was right. By early 1936, Ethiopian resistance was collapsing under relentless Italian pressure. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile and later appeared before the League in Geneva, delivering a stark warning. "It is us today," he said. "It will be you tomorrow." His words echoed through the chamber and were promptly ignored. Within months, sanctions were lifted. Italy kept its conquest. The League survived in name, but its authority was shattered for Adolf Hitler. Watching closely from Berlin, the lesson could not have been clearer. Treaties could be broken, aggression could succeed, and the world would look away. In March 1936, Germany took its most dangerous step yet, and it was taken not on the fringes of Europe, but at its very center. Citing the recent Franco-Soviet treaty as a threat to German security, Adolf Hitler ordered German troops to cross the Rhine and enter the demilitarized Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact, this region was to remain permanently free of German forces, serving as a security buffer for France. Its remilitarization was explicitly forbidden. This was no symbolic gesture. It was a direct challenge to the post-war system and a calculated risk. The German army was still weak. Hitler had ordered his commanders to retreat immediately if French forces intervened. Later testimony would reveal how tense the moment truly was in Berlin. France possessed the strongest army in Europe and had every legal right to act. Yet it did not. Political divisions, fear of escalation, and the absence of firm British support paralyzed decision-making in Paris. Britain, for its part, viewed the move with concern but little urgency. Many politicians argued that Germany was merely marching into its own backyard. No sanctions followed. No troops advanced. No shots were fired. For Hitler, the outcome was transformational. What had begun as a gamble ended as a triumph. His domestic popularity soared. The authority of the French alliance system collapsed. Most importantly, the myth of deterrence was destroyed. Germany had violated two major treaties at once and faced no consequences. The Rhineland crisis marked a turning point. It proved that the democracies would not fight, even when the legal case was clear and the military odds favored them. From this moment on, German rearmament would proceed without restraint, and future demands would be bolder, faster, and more dangerous. Europe had failed its last easy test. While Europe hesitated, other powers drew very different conclusions from the collapse of international order. By 1936, it was no longer only Germany that was preparing for conflict. Across Eurasia, states were rearming at speed, convinced that the future would be decided by force rather than law. In the East, the Soviet Union was undergoing a transformation of staggering scale. Under Joseph Stalin, the regime pushed forward with rapid industrialization and military expansion. New factories rose across the country, producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in ever-increasing numbers. The cost was immense. Living standards were sacrificed, repression intensified, and millions were coerced into meeting impossible production targets. Yet from Stalin's perspective, survival demanded it. The Soviet leadership did not know where the next attack would come from Nazi Germany in the West, or Imperial Japan in the East, and therefore prepared for both. In Asia, Japan was already acting. Having seized Manchuria earlier in the decade, the Japanese military continued to expand its influence in northern China. Civilian governments in Tokyo struggled to restrain radical officers who believed that Japan's future lay in conquest and empire. Although full-scale war had not yet begun, clashes, occupations, and proxy regimes steadily eroded Chinese sovereignty. China itself was divided and weakened. Internal conflict between nationalist and communist forces had drained the country's strength, leaving it vulnerable to external pressure. Each Japanese advance further exposed the inability of the international community to defend weaker states against aggression. What united these developments was a shared assumption. The existing system would not protect anyone. Treaties could be ignored. Sanctions could be endured. Appeals to international institutions led nowhere. By 1936, the world was no longer drifting toward conflict, it was preparing for it. Armies expanded, industries shifted to wartime production, and leaders planned for scenarios they publicly denied. The failure to stop Germany in Europe had sent a signal far beyond its borders. Power, not principle, was becoming the final arbiter of international affairs. In July 1936, Europe's simmering tensions erupted into a localized but pivotal conflict, the Spanish Civil War. Spain had elected a left-wing Popular Front government earlier that year, triggering immediate outrage among conservative and nationalist factions. Within days, a coup was launched by army officers determined to overthrow the government. The rebellion quickly secured control over parts of Morocco, the Canary Islands, and the city of Seville, but the Republican government retained most major cities. The country was plunged into chaos. What made Spain significant was not the scale of the conflict, but the involvement of foreign powers. Germany and Italy provided material support, weapons, aircraft, and troops to the nationalists. The Germans formed the famous Condor Legion, which used the war as a testing ground for new aerial tactics and bombing strategies. Italy sent its black shirt militia and modern equipment to support Franco's forces. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, though ideologically opposed to the nationalists, supplied the Republicans with weapons and advisors, hoping to contain fascist expansion. The war rapidly escalated from a domestic rebellion into an international proxy conflict. Civilians on both sides were armed, radicalized, and mobilized. Entire cities became laboratories for modern warfare, urban bombardments, coordinated airstrikes, and the early use of mechanized forces foreshadowed the tactics that would dominate the coming World War. Despite public declarations of neutrality, most European nations watched closely, often with sympathy toward one side or the other. The conflict exposed the weaknesses of the League of Nations, the ineffectiveness of collective security, and the growing willingness of dictators to intervene abroad without fear of consequence. Spain became the rehearsal stage for the next great conflagration, a war that would engulf all of Europe and eventually the world. For Adolf Hitler, it was the perfect opportunity to train troops, test new weapons, and support an ideological ally, all while the rest of Europe debated what to do. The summer of 1936 brought the world's attention to Berlin. The Olympic Games, a spectacle of sport and international diplomacy, would become one of Adolf Hitler's most potent propaganda tools. From the outside, Germany appeared orderly, modern, and unified. Streets were decorated with flags, athletes were well prepared, and foreign visitors were impressed by the efficiency and grandeur of the event. Anti-Semitic signs were temporarily removed, and Nazi leaders presented an image of a peaceful, thriving nation. The Games were a showcase, a country restored to prominence, politically stable, and economically revitalized. Yet beneath the spectacle, a different reality was taking shape. Behind closed doors, Hitler and his inner circle were executing the four-year plan, a secret program designed to prepare Germany for total war. Under Hermann Göring, the economy was being mobilized to produce raw materials and industrial capacity crucial for military independence. Coal, iron, chemicals, textiles, and aluminum, all essential for sustaining a modern war effort, were being prioritized. The regime's outward gestures of peace concealed a nation arming for a conflict it fully intended to provoke. The Olympics were also a lesson in manipulation. Foreign dignitaries were dazzled, journalists were impressed, and many international visitors returned home believing that Germany had truly been rehabilitated. In Britain, some figures, including King Edward VIII, even questioned whether the Nazis might not be entirely bad. So persuasive was the illusion of prosperity and order. But Hitler's assurances of peace were deceptive. His vision was expansionist, ideological, and ruthless. He saw a war not as an accident, but as an inevitable war to crush the Soviet Union, defeat Judeo-Bolshevism, and secure living space for the German people. The Olympic pageantry was only a mask for the strategy quietly being laid in factories, airfields, and planning rooms across the Reich. In November 1936, the diplomatic landscape of Europe shifted once more. Just a year earlier, Italy had been nominally aligned with Britain and France in the stress of front of fragile coalition, aimed at containing Germany. That alignment was shattered by Mussolini's conquest of Ethiopia and the failure of the League of Nations to enforce sanctions. The front was dead, and a new order began to emerge. On November 1st, Benito Mussolini announced a formal alliance with Adolf Hitler, creating the Rome-Berlin axis. The pact was deceptively simple in its terms. Both nations would cooperate to combat communism, support Francisco Franco in Spain, and pursue their colonial ambitions. Yet its implications were profound. For the first time, to major European dictators had formalized a partnership, signaling that the continent's balance of power was being reshaped not by diplomacy, but by force and ideology. This alliance emboldened Hitler. The Rhineland had already shown him that France and Britain would hesitate, and now Mussolini's Italy provided both military and political support. Together, the Axis nations could openly challenge international agreements, intervene in foreign conflicts, and pursue territorial expansion with reduced fear of opposition. The Axis also sent a chilling message to smaller states. Independence and neutrality no longer guaranteed security. Borders drawn by treaties or defended by collective agreements could be violated without consequence. The world was learning, painfully, that the only language dictators understood was power. Meanwhile, in Britain, uncertainty and ambivalence persisted. King Edward VIII's sympathies toward Hitler, later a source of scandal, reflected a broader hesitation among segments of the British elite, who still clung to the illusion that diplomacy and admiration could restrain the right. Across Europe, however, the evidence was mounting that Hitler had no intention of moderation. December 1936 brought the striking events that symbolized the world's fractured state. In Britain, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne after months of scandal over his intention to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Beyond personal controversy, the abdication highlighted the complex interplay of politics, public opinion, and the monarchy. Some Britons quietly welcomed his departure, aware of the king's admiration for Adolf Hitler, a sentiment that unsettled both politicians and citizens alike. Britain's domestic distractions left it less capable of confronting the growing threats on the continent. Across the Atlantic, the United States entrenched its isolationist stance. Public opinion was overwhelmingly against involvement in any overseas conflict by 1936. Polls indicated that over 90% of Americans opposed entering another European war. Congress reinforced this mood with a series of neutrality acts, legally barring the sale of arms to nations at war. For Americans, the horrors of World War I had left a lasting scar, and the prevailing belief was that the United States should remain a distant spectator, while Europe and Asia sorted out their conflicts. Yet the world was no longer a place where spectatorship guaranteed safety. Germany, Italy, Japan, and other emerging powers were consolidating their strength, testing borders, and pursuing expansionist ambitions. Totalitarian regimes were mastering propaganda, secret police, and mass mobilization, demonstrating that unchecked aggression could be not only tolerated, but rewarded. By the end of 1936, the stage was set for a global confrontation. The democratic powers were distracted or divided. Isolationist nations watched from afar. Meanwhile, dictators had learned that bold, calculated moves, whether in Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, or Madrid, could reshape the world without immediate consequence. The illusions of peace and security were gone. Europe and the globe were on the cusp of a war that would dwarf the horrors of the previous generation, a war the world had all but invited by, failing to act decisively against. The first challengers to international order